In December 1836, one of the last things you'd expect to happen in southern England happened right here. What had been one of the worst winter storms in England and here in Lewes became one of the deadliest when a lethal amount of snow had built up on the cliff where I'm standing right now. And for the people living at the bottom of this cliff, it was going to turn into a Christmas to forget. This is the Lewes Avalanche. The town of Lewes in East Sussex is probably most famous for its bonfire night celebrations, but it's also famous for something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to happen a few miles away from the south coast of England, or in England in general. When we talk about avalanches, I mean, the UK isn't even necessarily famous for avalanches anywhere, but if you were going to expect something like an avalanche, you might think of the Highlands up in Scotland, or Snowdonia in Wales, or any of the actually slightly mountainous regions of the UK. But not here. Here, in 1836, the completely unexpected occurred, and it was triggered by a winter storm that was so unusually bad that Victorian newspapers dubbed it the Great Snow of 1836. In fact, it was so bad that it was remembered famously for disrupting the country's communication system, so the post service. And actually, just down the road in Brighton, the Brighton Patriot in December 1836 had described how the town had been visited by one of the most severe snowstorms remembered by the oldest men in Brighton. Gotta remember, this was when the weather was recorded by going, "Hey, really old Jim, what was the winter like when you were a lad?" Christmas Eve and Boxing Day 1836 had brought huge amounts of snow. But during the night from the 26th of December into the 27th, that snow intensified dramatically. And contemporary reports from papers like the Sussex Advertiser described Lewes as being completely overwhelmed by snow. And they described banks 10 to 15 feet deep in some places. Lewes itself sits in a bit of a dip. It lies on the River Ouse where the river cuts through the South Downs, and there is a particular place called Cliffe Hill, a large chalk cliff that is still here today. And in 1836, at the base of that cliff stood a group of buildings known as Boulder Row, which, we'll come to find out, was quite an apt name for them. And here is where several poor labouring families lived. And knowing what we know now, they might have felt a little overlooked, a little intimidated by the massive cliff behind them. And in fact, there were some reports of the locals that lived there having actually complained of their situation. The Brighton Guardian in 1837 recorded that the situation of the houses had been repeatedly complained of. And you can understand why. I'm sure living under that cliff in 1836, I'm sure they must have been used to the odd boulder showing up in their back garden. But as it would turn out, those smaller rockfalls would turn out to just be foreboding warnings of what was to come just after midday on Tuesday the 27th of December, when, after this incredibly intense winter storm, a huge amount of snow had built up on that chalk cliff. And just after midday, as you can imagine, maybe the sun had come out and started to melt some of that ice and snow. A huge slab of snow broke loose from the top of the chalk cliff. Well, I am now slowly making my way up the cliff. Because it wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't decide to go on a really long, unnecessary walk at some point. Some of you might be wondering, Tom, this is a reasonably straightforward story. Why couldn't you just make this from your office instead of coming out into this? But one, this is how I differentiate myself from the AI scourge that is swarming YouTube right now. And two, quite enjoy this. I had really grand plans for the opening of this video. I was going to do my spiel, blah, blah, blah. This is where I am, this is what happened. This is the last place you'd expect something like this to happen. Big zoom out, drone shot, cliffs, blah. Nah. Best laid plans and all that. The number of times I come and I bring all my fancy stuff and end up just filming the entire thing on my phone. I'm sure the views from up here are spectacular. Can't really see it at the moment, but... So, about here is where this huge 20-foot deep wedge of compact snow from this horrible storm was gathered. And so I'm stood pretty much literally where the snow that went down this hill and destroyed these houses and unfortunately killed these 8 people was. You would not have wanted to be anywhere down there when this huge pile of snow and rock came down. Reports from the time claimed that that huge mass of snow that had gathered up there was actually about 20 feet deep. Now, this huge mass of snow on the cliff had been building up long enough for people to have seen that there was possibly some danger there. And those living in the houses at the base of the cliff had been warned to move out if they could until that snow had melted away. But perhaps not realizing the true danger they were in, nobody left their home. Even when they'd seen that the day before, on the 26th, a huge amount of snow had already fallen from a cliff top down onto a nearby timber yard, which had not just been completely destroyed, but actually swept into the River Ouse. And you can kind of understand why they didn't want to leave their homes, despite the potential danger, because the only alternative they had if they left was to go to the workhouse. And of course, at the time you've got a home, you're not going to go to the workhouse unless you are completely desperate. So you can kind of understand why they decided to just try their luck. Okay, I'm going to take a huge stab in the dark and say that I think this might have been where that timber yard was. It's interesting, as you walk along South Street here, there's actually quite a few rows of houses that look pretty similar to what they may have looked like when they were here at the time. Obviously a little bit more modern than 1836, but it gives you an idea of the kind of rows of small terraced houses, cottages, that would have been here and that were caught up in this horrifying disaster. The cliffs really do tower above this street. It is quite intimidating. Yeah, you can definitely understand why living down here at the base of these things, you would be, I don't know, you'd never forget they were there, let's just put it that way. I find it quite funny that they've built this tunnel thing through the cliff here. Obviously, I'm sure it was intended to free up traffic that was probably building up going through Lewes. But let's say there was another avalanche. It would probably kind of work as a bit of a snow break. Just goes to show this is another perfect example of how actually coming to the place, the thing, the story, the event, the bad thing happened makes it feel so much more real. I mean, you look at pictures of what happened and you see the cliffs, and even from here, you know, you're looking at me here, it looks like a white cliff, but it doesn't look like, you know, mountains. But when you stood at the bottom of it, it looks really intimidating. When you add into that the fact that you know what happened here, it makes it all the more scary. We're not sure exactly what time it happened, but somewhere between around 10:15 a.m. and just after midday, that huge slab of snow at the top of the cliff broke away. It swept down the cliffside and crashed with incredible force onto those workers' cottages, destroying and then burying them in an instant, along with, and we're not sure exactly how many, but reports were that around 15 people were in the buildings at the time the avalanche occurred. A quote from the Sussex Advertiser at the time described the houses as being instantly buried up to the height of the second floors. And local witnesses described how the cottages had been actually pushed into the road by the huge amount of snow, leaving barely a trace of what had been there before, except for just what looked like a new mound of white snow. The Sussex Weekly Advertiser also reported that the mass appeared to strike the houses first at the base, heaving them upwards, and then breaking over them like a gigantic wave. There was nothing but a mound of pure white. It is pretty mental to think that where I'm standing right now, on that day in 1836, I would have been at the shallowest point, buried under 20 feet of snow. And not just snow, rubble, debris, anything that remained of those demolished houses. It's just impossible to picture the carnage that was right here.
Those who witnessed the disaster immediately dove in to try and rescue whoever they could. Everyone jumped in. There were navvies, quarry workers, just regular people, all helping to do what they could, which for a lot of people just involved digging away at this snow with their bare hands. And it took hours. In fact, almost 7 hours were spent trying to dig people out of the wreckage. And ultimately, they did manage to pull 7 people out alive. But unfortunately, by the time rescue work came to a halt, the 8 remaining people had suffocated under the weight of that snow. After they'd removed about 14 of the people, survivors and the dead, they heard a faint groan. That was 14-year-old John Bridgman. But as he was being dragged from the snow, another huge amount of snow broke away from the cliff and buried him and some of his rescuers. And by the time they'd extricated themselves from the snow and managed to get him out, he was extremely exhausted and his leg had been fractured in 2 places. He and the other survivors were taken to the local workhouse where local surgeons could start trying to help them. Apparently the only 2 in these houses to escape completely unscathed were 2 babies who were both only 6 weeks old. And one of the survivors, a young woman called Fanny Boakes, was actually pulled out alive after being trapped under the snow for more than 6 hours. And in Lewes, she became known locally as the Snowdrop Girl. Incredibly, the white dress that Fanny was wearing when she was rescued actually still exists and is being kept by the Sussex Archaeological Society. Unfortunately though, we can't go and see it because it's not being kept out for conservation reasons. You can understand why a dress from 1836 might not survive too well out in the open, so I get it, but it's a shame we can't see it.
Behind me, just over my shoulder there, is the inn that they built 4 years after this disaster. And as part of that wonderful tradition, British tradition of naming things quite literally after the worst thing that happened there, they called it the Snowdrop Inn. The bitter irony was that in trying to avoid the workhouse no matter what, those that survived what happened ended up there anyway. And those that didn't ended up somewhere far, far worse. Those 8 that lost their lives ended up here at South Malling Church. They were buried in an unmarked communal grave. So, unfortunately, that means chances of us finding them are probably pretty slim. Obviously, it goes without saying that this was an awful and, let's face it, probably avoidable tragedy, which unfortunately led to 8 people losing their lives, and 8 people from poor backgrounds. And if we really look at it, part of the reason they lost their lives is because of the situation they found themselves in. They did not want to give up their homes because they had something. As poor as they were, they had a home to hold on to, and the idea of leaving to go to the workhouse must have just been, well, clearly stronger than anything else. Just shows you how important somebody's home is to them, no matter how small or, you know, what some would consider poor it is. It's their home and they didn't want to leave. And given the situation, you can kind of understand why. But unfortunately, that meant that for these 8 unfortunate people, they ended up here. And on top of that, so many families were devastated and children left orphaned.
The 8 people who died in the avalanche were William Gear, 82, Phoebe Barnden, 45, Mary Taylor, 42, Susan Hayward, 34, M.A. Bridgman, 28, Jane Boakes, 25, Joseph Wood, 15, and Mary Bridgman, 11. What, of course, adds to this tragedy, despite obviously this being a tragic event no matter what time of year it happened, but the fact that this was Christmas made this even more heartbreaking. And a writer from the time, W. Thompson, pointed out that amongst the debris from the ruined cottages, they found pieces of cake and plum pudding, intermingled with holly and other evergreens. Bitter memorials of the festivity of Christmas. After the inquest into the disaster, understandably, a verdict of accidental death was recorded. A local fund was set up to help the families, and about £394, 5 shillings and 6 was raised. £193 of that was given to the families to replace various clothing and furniture that they'd lost. The remaining amount was put into a savings fund for the benefit of those children that were left orphaned and injured. Unfortunately, it seems like we can't get inside because at the time there was actually money raised for a memorial stone tablet, which is apparently on the north wall of the church on the inside, which has the names of those who died on it, but it seems we can't get inside at the moment, unfortunately, to show you that. But yep, that is in there somewhere. It's a shame. I'd love to be able to go inside just to see the inside of the church, because it looks obviously like a very old, cosy little church in there, and love an old cosy church. I just have to make do with walking around the lovely rewilded little graveyard. And a really nice little aside about this particular church, kind of tucked away here, it's nice and quiet, is it's actually being specifically managed for wildlife and biodiversity. You know, they seem to have jumped on board the whole kind of rewilding project that's going on in a lot of different places in the UK, and you can tell it's really nice. It's clearly well kept, but areas in between the graves like this, you can see the grass has been left to grow a little bit longer. It's just, yeah, it's a nice idea. Well, from peaceful South Malling Church, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, then feel free to leave a comment, suggest other topics that I can go out and cover, and subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to be making plenty more videos like this, and I already have quite a lot at this point of other stuff on the channel. But yeah, that's all I need to say, I think. So I'll see you in the next one.